Please be seated. It is a bit of a pleasure for me to this morning invite you to offer a warm welcome to Vicki Hughes, longtime parishioner here at Ascension Church. She's a filmmaker, she's a teacher, she's a tutor. She's passionate about justice, she loves creatures, she's part of the Green Team, she leads the Education for Ministry group, much beloved. And she's also a passionate theologian, and we often have discussions about concepts, theological concepts. But she's also a storyteller, and I think what she's about to attempt here with much confidence is to take some of those theological ideas that can be profound and wonderful and to try and bring them down, this sense of God's immanence, transcendence, and immanence. And I hope I haven't taken the wind out of your sails. But please welcome Vicki Hughes.
Good morning. So mic working, it keeps falling off. Merry 5th day of Christmas, 4th day of Hanukkah, 3rd day of Kwanzaa. In the beginning was the Word. For some of us, it's easy to see, or we think we see, that in John's Gospel, and the writer of John's Gospel, had an innate love of and understanding of God transcendent. The glory of God, the divinity of the Jesus story spoke to John more profoundly than any other part. Some of us in this room, I know, would kind of see it that way. In the Christmas season, what we're called to do is define for ourselves what that word is and to welcome, or as Brad put it Christmas Eve, say the great yes to the story of the God that's immanent. And it's a profound time of year of putting both those pieces of the picture together. God immanent, God transcendent. The idea of the transcendent God, I have a profound memory of when, even though I didn't have the language for it, I think I had the experience of it. I was 10. It was 1968, and I was allowed to go to midnight mass for the first time. No more breaking Christmas Day up between stockings and big presents and breaking the happy moment. I could go to midnight mass with my mom and my dad and be a grown-up. And it was the point at which, if you grew up Roman, the Latin mass was getting knocked out the door and we could actually understand what was going on. That night, it had snowed that day. We were all living in Birkdale, Southport, which is between Liverpool and Preston, on the west coast of England. And it had snowed that day, not a whole lot, just a little bit. But by the time we went out, after I'd had my nap, the clouds were breaking apart and the stars were coming out. And we walked to church, and I was getting to walk in this crisp winter air, and there were all these stars. And I was out there, and it was the dark of night, and it was snowy, and it was beautiful. And it just took me away. And I felt part of something infinitely bigger than I was that made me feel very, very small and very, very big at the same time. In our church, St. Joseph's, the creche was big. It was like a cave, and the figures were like half human size. but it was low to the ground. And this I learned years later. The parish did it this way because there was inherent belief, to symbolize an inherent belief that a child who could just stand in front of this creche saw right in it and was part of that moment. For the adult, worn out a little by experience, less rough, shiny, sparkly, or rough around the edges, depending on how you look at it, had to bend down. Because the parish priest said, and as I said, I learned this much later, to understand the idea that divinity enters humanity, that divinity enters its creation, the miracle of God entering into the human experience. To understand that miracle, you have to engage your sense of wonder and curiosity that is natural to children and a little harder for adults to find. Okay, can we still hear me? Okay. And I'm not sure that it was that year, but it was in that framework of time that my mother also pointed out when I was beginning to ask those questions that kids ask when they're working out God and stuff. And she said, did you notice that when Jesus came, he came as a child? God came, and they needed to be taken care of. They needed parents. They needed the love that takes care. God surrenders to their creation by letting their creation participate and take care of them. In this case, Jesus. Jump ahead about 13 years. It's 1981, or I can't remember if it was 81 or 82. I was, my dad was Council of Embassy at the American Embassy in Tel Aviv in Israel, Palestine, and I was teaching at a Scottish high school in Jaffa. And that Christmas, I spent up in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And they're really only about 13 miles apart, and back then there wasn't a horrible wall and checkpoints and harsh stuff. But I was up there between the week between Christmas and New Year's. And it was cold. Also snowing. It was very cold. And the practical reality, which I had accepted somewhat intellectually as a student in the Religious Studies Department in UVA, the practical reality of the fact that any self-respecting shepherd would not have been out in the fields in the dead of winter. They would have been in a nice warm cave with their sheep. And I knew all the practical parts, the Roman church hung it there because Roman Saturnalia, therefore solstice, and it works in that spot. But when you read it with that sort of historical realism, the story becomes more mythic. And for a brief period of time, and maybe it was the weather, and that first encounter with it, not just intellectually, but emotionally, I knew that the dead of winter, it probably, or at least possibly, didn't happen then. And it didn't last long, but it was, in a sense, a harsh reality, because for a time I was left again with just the transcendent God. The immanent God was a little harder to see. But I was lucky/blessed because at that time I was teaching students of all faiths in a school that lived out loving one another. The faculty were from all faiths. And I would argue that they were wiser voices in my experience. And as my mom reminded me, if you believe in incarnation, then you participate in that creativity and you help take care of the universe. So for the next 4 years, I was living in the place where the framework of the foundational stories that if we call ourselves Christians, we get to live out. And when you ask yourself the question, in the beginning was the Word, and who and what was the Word? If you open yourself to that possibility, the incarnation becomes alive. Because in that environment and in the stories that we hear, the adult Jesus, who came as a poor, impoverished child, lives out vulnerability lived large. This was a guy who came and fed the hungry, even though he wasn't rich. Rejected political power, power over human beings that divinity could claim. He fed the hungry, he healed the sick, he comforted those in fear, he liberated women to a large degree from some of the constraints of their time, and he asked his disciples to do the same thing. If a guy asks for your shirt, give him your coat as well. Be vulnerable. And he was so vulnerable that he submitted to the political power of the time and died. And that's the only way that we get past the fear of death to rebirth and resurrection. Sidestep for this for a second. The lectionary, in all of its messiness and sometimes odd wisdom, gives us the whole arc of the human story of Jesus in the first third of the year. We go from birth, Magi, many of the surrendering moments of Jesus, to the passion and the resurrection in 4 months. It's giving us an encapsulated yearly reminder of this God who is immanent and who is totally subject to the world in which they come. God so loved the world. If we're left with a transcendent God, we still have it. We've got God as creator. And if you think about it, creativity by definition is vulnerable. Think about the first present you ever made in school and gave to your mom or your dad. Think about the first piece of work that you do, that you're proud of and that you let into the world. Think about writing a beautiful contract to take care of people, creating a piece of music, a poem, making a meal for somebody that you care about, to give to the world. The creator becomes the subject, makes themselves vulnerable to the receiver. So even if you just have God transcendent, it seems to me that you have God vulnerable, this creator that gave us all of its creation, the world to participate in. But it's my spiritual journey, and we all go on them, and they're all different because we bring our experience to the story. Let's put it this way. the angels and the shepherds, and the journey through the snow came alive again. We participate in this creativity of God if we believe in the miracle that it is. If we allow ourselves to open up what the vulnerable God means, so that we can get through the hard times because we know the joy is there, then we have to open ourselves imaginatively and practically to the miracles that surround us. If we see them, we'll see shepherds in the people who give from all that they have to the world that's God's. We see the wise persons who bring their gifts of intellect and insight and risk it all to stand up for what they believe. We get to see the angels in those who joyfully proclaim the miracles that we live in. And we don't just get to see them. We get to be them. We get to be the shepherds in the bleak midwinter by giving ourselves, taking care of each other as God asked us to take care of them in the person of Jesus. We get to bring our creativity and passion to this story. And we get even to be the angels if we want, proclaiming the miracle of life as the way to get through the hardships of life. At Christmas, it all comes together. It does at Easter, too. And the story of the manger and the cross are inexplicably, it seems to me anyway, inexplicably interwoven. And it's up to us to live them. Amen.